All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Chow, and I am the Speakers Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. Also online is our Outreach Director, Ryan Gapsky, who will be co-moderating this event alongside me. I'm excited to welcome all of you to our debate on the search for common ground, conversations about the toughest questions in K-12 education. Before we introduce our guests this afternoon, I want to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We host lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2010. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs. They all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the cultivation and creation of new knowledge is prized, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. I'd also like to recognize the American Enterprise Institute Executive Council program for their gracious sponsorship of this event. The AEI Executive Council at Yale works to advance campus dialogue about public policy and introduce students and faculty to the scholarship of the American Enterprise Institute. AEI is a Washington-based, nonpartisan research think tank committed to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world through rigorous public policy scholarship. AEI also believes in the importance of a robust competition of ideas and aims to promote civil discourse on campus across the country. Now I'll let Ryan introduce our guest.
Frederick M. Hess is a resident scholar and the Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on K-12 and higher education issues. He is the author of Education Week's popular blog, Rick Hess Straight Up, and a regular contributor to Forbes and The Hill. He also serves as an executive director of Education Next and the co-host of the Common Ground podcast. He founded and chairs AEI's Conservative Education Reform Network. As an educator, political scientist, and author, Dr. Hess has published in scholarly outlets such as American Politics Quarterly, Harvard Education Review, Social Science Quarterly, Teachers College Record, and Urban Affairs Review. His work has also appeared in popular outlets including The Atlantic, National Affairs, National Review, The New York Times, USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. We'll first hear from Dr. Hess on his plan for education reform, and then we'll move on to questions from ourselves and the audience. Please submit your questions throughout the event using the Q&A feature located on the bottom of your screen. With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Frederick Hess virtually to Yale and to the Buckley program.
Hey, thanks, guys. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Ryan. Pleasure to be here with all of you today. Programs like the Buckley program have always been important, and I think are especially so, given some of the frustrations that, I and so many others have with the direction of conversation and reflection on campus today. So great to be here with you. Well, what I'll do is I'm going to kick off today. I'm going to take a few minutes and I'll talk about this new book that Kevin mentioned that I just published with my good friend, the Dean of the University of Southern California School of Education, Pedro Noguera. Pedro and I come at these issues real differently. He's on the board of The Nation. He is an ed school icon. I tend to be not the most popular character across America's schools of education. So he tends to come at these things very much from the left. I tend to come at them from the right. And especially today in America, it can feel like the fact that we disagree either on important principles or on specific programs, policies. It can feel like that's it. We got nothing to say. And, I think that's profoundly problematic. It's probably profoundly problematic in a republic, period. It's a tough way to live lives as citizens, but it's especially poisonous in the world of education. I mean, the entire premise of education, as I've always understood it, is it's a chance to cultivate the human mind. It's a chance to think more cogently, more reflectively, more powerfully today than we did the day before. It's in the business of both sharing knowledge and sparking understanding. I don't know how you do any of this if you only talk to people who share an echo chamber with you. So anyway, a couple of minutes, talk about this book Pedro and I did, which isn't really about how I would change higher ed or K-12 or what have you. And then we'll open it up and we can take whatever questions folks want to ask. So here's this book. About a year and a half ago, in late 2019, Pedro and I started talking about, hey, we are both frustrated as heck with the state of conversation today. With the fact that in schools of education, it's hard to have any meaningful conversation about a topic like affirmative action or what equity means or religious freedom without it becoming, well, frankly, it's not even a shouting match because there's not many people who are going to push back against kind of progressive convention at the moment. And on the right, I've been enormously frustrated that people who want to engage thoughtfully in a principled fashion have too often been shouted down as somehow, David Frenchites who are failing to stand up for principle. And so Pedro and I had a shared frustration that the people who we might agree with on a lot of policies were not engaging in ways that we thought constructive or healthy. And, it's certainly not us. Everybody, I'm sure, with us today, you guys live in this country, you know what I'm talking about. One of the more striking data points on this, which you're probably familiar with, is More in Common did a poll in 2019, right? And they found that 20% of Democrats and 16% of Republicans sometimes think we'd be better off as a country if large numbers of the opposing party just died. I mean, when you've gotten to this point, when 1 in 5, 1 in 6 Americans is willing to say that to a pollster, we've got a fundamental civic disease. And part of what's going on is the more we think that way and the more we turn to our favorite news sources. On the right, we turn to Fox. On the left, they turn to MSNBC and CNN and the New York Times and, well, pretty much the entire mainstream media. Let's be honest. The more we just go to the channels that speak to our biases, the more we get ratified in our convictions. Cass Sunstein wrote a beautiful piece on this about 20 years ago, where he pointed out that the social science on this is that we often talk about reflection and conversation as cultivating open-mindedness. In fact, it turns out that when you spend a lot of time talking to people who agree with you, everybody comes out of that conversation more certain that they were all right to begin with. So it turns out it totally stands the value of deliberation on its head. And, and Pedro and I were talking about this. We said, look, how often do we actually spend a lot of time at length talking to people who see it differently than we do? Now, look, if you work in education at AEI, a conservative think tank, I spend a huge chunk of my time engaging with people who disagree with me on a whole bunch of fundamental things. But I engage them over lunch. We talk for an hour in normal times, not during pandemic so much. Or I'm talking to reporters from media outlets who are left-leaning and we talk for 15 minutes. Or I'm on radio or TV and we're having a 40-minute debate, or it's a 3-minute soundbite or 30-second soundbite, and it's all about the quip. The amount of time we actually have, even in a job like mine, to really go back and forth and engage is remarkably limited. And so we started talking about that, and we said, look, let's try something. Let's try to have a conversation about a bunch of these issues where we just disagree at length. And so that's what we did. We started in January 2020, which turned out to be a strange time to start it, because it meant we did this book when the pandemic struck and schools shut down. It meant we did this book when George Floyd was killed and the riots broke out across the country. And Pedro and I obviously had processed these things, the school closures, the riots and the protests, in different ways, because we have different frames of experience. And what we did was we started to write to each other about a bunch of the big debates in education: the role of philanthropy, school choice, testing, how much should teachers be paid? And what we would do is one of us would write an email, 600, 800 words, kind of the length of an op-ed. The other guy would sleep on it, write back the next day. And then I'd sleep on it and write back. And we go back and forth about a half dozen times, and then we'd pick up another subject. We did high school civics. We did, anti-racist education. And, some of it was real data driven, some of it was more philosophical, but mostly what we did was we didn't so much, it turns out that when you write these things at length, you're less concerned with like scoring a slam dunk because nobody's watching. So it's not like you're trying to slam them on, Facebook or on Twitter. And it's not like you're trying to get the killer quip because you're like on a panel on TV together. Instead, the only person who's reacting is the other guy. And so it turns out you say, you know what? Let me read what you're doing. Let me actually listen to it, think on it. And then let me kind of tell you where I think you make sense and where I think you're out to lunch. And so that's what we did. We did it for about 6 or 8 months. The book just came out last week with Teachers College Press. It's called, in search of common ground. Because again, it wasn't about common ground. We don't agree. We didn't pretend to agree. We've both been on lots of those blue ribbon commissions where you hide big disagreements behind a bunch of buzzwords so that you can get a bunch of R's and D's to sign on to something. We didn't do that. Instead, we just said, look, let's try to figure out where we're on the same place and where we're not. And it turned out it was fundamentally different experience for me. In fact, it was the most heartening experience I've had. I've been at AEI since '02. Before that, I was a professor at the University of Virginia. I did my PhD back in the 90s. I was a high school teacher, started teaching high school 30 years ago. Got to tell you, actually getting to have a lengthy, sustained conversation about things I care about with somebody who sees them real differently, it's probably the most heartening thing I've done in the last 10 years or more. And the fact that colleges, that professional associations of educators don't do any of this, in retrospect, strikes me as astonishing. And it's just remarkable to me that we have paid so little attention to the value of sustained discourse. So let me talk a couple of the things that we talked about substantively. We talk about for-profits in education, school choice, and anti-racism. Just for a minute or two, just give you a sense. We could talk about all these in much more length if you have questions. On for-profits, for instance, I'm generally in favor of for-profits. I got to tell you, I think one of the problems with education is that it is so thorough, public education is so thoroughly dominated by government provision and nonprofits that it creates some really unhealthy distortions. In particular, for-profits are really good at two things. One, they got a huge incentive to squeeze costs because if they can reduce costs, they can make more money. Turns out, government agencies don't work on this principle. Who would have thought it? I got a PhD in poli-sci, I can tell you. I knew this a long time ago. It also turns out, if you think about it for a second, that nonprofits tend to be pretty bad at this. Teach for America, for instance, when it started in the early 90s, cost $10,000 per recruit. Today, 30 years on, TFA, which is, other than it's, I have issues with its ideological bent, but it's a terrific organization and it does important work. It spends about 5 times that, about $50,000 per recruit. Now, that's not the way things work in the private sector. It works that way in the nonprofit sector because there's funders who are eager to pay it because they want the whole bells and whistles experience. In the private sector, you'd be saying, how do we get this cheaper? How do we break this down? Second thing for-profits do really well is they try to grow like the Dickens because they want to serve more people because they have a selfish reason to get more folks in the door so they can generate more revenues. California community college system, normal times, turns away 150,000 people a year. Why? Because the money that we get from them, the couple of $1,000 doesn't cover their marginal tuition because the California community college system is heavily subsidized by the state so that a year of community college costs more like 10 grand. And so they figure, hey, here's our numbers. And if it doesn't work for you, tough, try to look us up in 6 months and see if we can accommodate you. So for me, for-profits have a valuable role because they push education to think more about cost efficiency and worry about how do you actually accommodate the needs of more folks. Now, for-profits also have their downsides. Pedro pointed these out. The fact that you want to squeeze costs means you can cut corners. He pointed this out. The fact that you want to serve more people means you can start selling chia pets on 2 a.m. in an infomercial and play people for suckers. He pointed this out. He was right on both of those. Pedro also talked about, as a kid growing up in New York City, how he loved the New York City subway system because he got to see his dad ride a subway in which lawyers in suits and working guys in scuffed boots rode the same mode of transport. And he's like, look, we might live in different houses. People might have different experiences, but there were these things that said, we are all, we're all New Yorkers together. And I get that. I get that. It's a powerful statement of equality. But, and thinking about it that way was helpful because it made it less of an abstract conversation. And I said, Pedro, I totally take the point. Problem is, the number of places in the US where you can actually make the New York City subway system work effectively, at best, is like 5. And it actually turns out to be really hard to make the T work in Boston that effectively, or like the L in Chicago. And when you get to places like Houston or Atlanta or Phoenix, it just doesn't work because the geography is so different. And there, you do need to provide for the transportation needs of everybody, but it probably makes more sense to think of a mix of Uber and scooters and Zipcar and buses and a whole mess of public and private transportation entities. And maybe you need some coordination at the municipal level. That's fair. But you don't need to have them run by a nonprofit arm of the city. So, we came out. Do we agree? Of course not. But it was a conversation where we're talking about for-profits, not by him saying, I want to rip off families, and me saying he doesn't care, but by us talking about different ways of thinking about a challenge. We had a similar kind of conversation when it came to school choice. I'm generally a school choice guy. I don't think school choice fixes anything, but I think it opens doors for educators and families and communities to get the schools going that they need, whether it's charter schools or school vouchers to let families use privates or new privates or education savings accounts. And Pedro said, look, he said, I'm okay with charters. He said, if they're good charters, they work for kids. I'm nervous about the other stuff. But he said, my real concern is charters aren't one thing. You guys, Rick, guys like you can be in favor of choice, but look, there are traditional district schools that are good and ones that are terrible. And there's charter schools that are good and charter schools that are terrible. And what we ought to be focused on more is the quality of the education a kid's getting rather than whether we call it a district school or charter school. I'm like, look, I don't think that's a ridiculous premise. Now, I do think that locking families in district schools is a problem because it means they don't have any way to get out unless they have enough money to buy their way into a private school or another school district. But your point is certainly a legitimate one. And that's why we've got to spend more attention worrying about the quality of charter schooling. I serve on the board of directors of an outfit called the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. Pedro speaks about this with experience because he worked in New York State on the charter authorizer when he was a professor at NYU. And so we wound up in a conversation that's also about how do we protect kids and families from folks who are running truly terrible schools, whether they're district schools or whether, do we come at it differently? Of course we do. Do we agree about the right solutions? Not really. But it turns out, again, there's lots of points of agreement. Let me touch on one third thing before I wrap this up. Let me talk for a bit just about anti-racism. There's a lot of talk about in civics education, about whether schools should have the 1619 project, about how do we address, truly horrific elements of American history. Pedro and I both started out as social studies high school teachers, 3 decades ago. I said, look, do I think that American history has been told in simplified ways? Of course I do. I've argued that for many years. Do we need to pay more attention to all the ways in which we have failed to live up to our principles, to our founding documents? We absolutely need to talk about that. We need to talk about that seriously and in depth. But talking about it seriously and in depth does not mean to me the Howard Zinn school of thought that America is somehow uniquely evil. It does not mean the 1619 project pronouncing America a slaveocracy. These are simple-minded cartoon versions of America, which are no better than the simple cartoon versions of America that we used to learn in the 1950s. What we need is a complicated version of America, which respects all the wonderful, phenomenal things about this country, how it's been the most successful, longest lasting, free nation, and most successful multi-ethnic nation in the history of the world, without failing to talk honestly about all of the ways that we have to do better. And Pedro said, look, I'm there. He said, we also need to talk about structural problems. It's not just enough to talk about these things. We need to talk about making sure every kid has an access to advanced placement coursework, even kids from predominantly Black schools where those classes aren't offered. We need to talk about discrepancies in disciplinary policy. We need to talk about, brick and mortar stuff. And I said, I hear you. Here's my problem. When I hear people start talking that way, they often start telling me that not only do we need to make sure discipline is fair, but that any discipline which does not reflect racial makeup of the school should be presumed to be racist. I said, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't think that's useful. I told him, I've heard people, when we talk about the importance of personal responsibility, they say that is a white supremacist term. I said, I can't abide by that. The Smithsonian Museum of African American History came out last summer and on its website said that values like objectivity are part of a white supremacist heritage. I said, I can't work with that. And I can't work with people who want to cancel Cat in the Hat. And Pedro, and what I found a particularly powerful response to all this, said, I'm not going to defend things that I'm not going to defend. And having somebody who is an icon of the progressive left, who's on the board of the nation, make distinctions between things that are actually going to solve real problems of inequality and unequal opportunity, at the same time, not standing and defending things which seem to me goofy and which he acknowledges are goofy, was for me a really powerful suggestion that, look, there actually is lots of common stuff we can agree on. And maybe the 20% who really enjoy Twitter fights aren't going to be able to find any principled places. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here. So let me pull this all together a little bit. Big takeaway for me there's a dozen of these exchanges. I'm not going to bore you to death. I'm sure I've already done plenty of that. One big takeaway for me is that we forget how much mode of discourse matters. We've gotten very used, especially during the pandemic, to talking to each other via Zoom and on social media. And these are mechanisms which reward short engagement. They reward people to play to a crowd. They work against long, sustained personal interaction. And I think we forget how much that kind of form of interaction can shape how we actually wind up talking to each other and looking at each other. At National Review yesterday, Isaac Shore, one of the Buckley Fellows at NRO, at National Review, I think, had a really nice column on this. Just on campus, we've got to spend a lot more time. You guys have got to spend a lot more time making sure that how you're talking about it gives you an opportunity for understanding, because it matters more than I think we sometimes imagine. Second, both Pedro and I, at the end of the day, are practical people in the sense that we both work with superintendents. We both wind up getting called by people on Capitol Hill for suggestions. We get called by governors for what they might do. So we are less interested in what's going to make for a wild Instagram than in how do you actually kind of move a good idea forward. And I think that's really healthy. It can be dangerous when you're never thinking about how does this work in practice, because it gets you really far removed from the ins and outs. And third, again, I just think the easiest thing is, look, it's real easy for all of us, especially in this kind of pandemic bubble, to spend most of our time talking to people who would agree with us about most stuff. And what I love about something like the Buckley program, what I love, what I hope you guys are doing, and it sure seems to me like you are, is looking for opportunities to engage with smart people who are going to come at stuff differently. Because that, at the end of the day, has got to be the alpha and the omega of how we think about higher education in this country. With that, let me stop, guys, and we can open up to whatever.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hess, for starting us off with that wonderful talk. I just wanted to take this opportunity to invite our audience members to submit questions, which can be accessed via the Q&A feature at the bottom right of your Zoom windows. But now for the first question. The K-12 education system serves a variety of students with different backgrounds and goals. Some students attend college after high school graduation, and some immediately enter the workforce. Given this, how should American high schools address the competing priorities of first preparing students for college, and second, equipping students with important life skills and a more general sort of education?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like, it's one of these questions that we spent 30 years. People made whole careers talking over without anybody knowing what the hell they're talking about. So we come up with all these, clever kind of acronyms like CALEAR, college and workforce readiness, blah, blah, blah. Look, at the end of the day, I don't think the goal should be to prepare people for college, because I'm not actually sure what that means. College encompasses everything from Yale to, community, the vast majority of higher ed institutions in this country accept everybody who applies. There is no criteria for admission. If you got a high school diploma, they accept you. And so when we talk about what do you need for college, frankly, it's a piece of paper. What I do think we want to make sure is that everybody walks away at the age of 18 with the skills, the competencies, the knowledge that let them chart their own course, whether they want to pursue some post-secondary education or not. So what is that? That means people need to know math and science. They've got to be, literate. They need to have some general grounding in, American history and civics and culture. So, there's questions about, should these things be non-negotiable? Of course they should be non-negotiable. This needs to be a foundation. There's also the question about soft skills. Should schools teach them? Sure they should. Because when you are actually going in and interviewing for a job, whether it's, working behind the desk at Enterprise Rental Car, or working at a Starbucks, or some executive job, there's things people are looking for. And those of us who are socialized in some environments, especially educated professional parents, tend to learn about how to operate in those environments. And other people don't have those same advantages. We've got to make sure every kid is given the ability to pursue their dreams in whatever way, whatever that we need. But look, should these things be college skills? Of course not. The idea that you should have to go hang out at a post-secondary institution, whether or not you want to get a piece of paper to be allowed to apply for a job is nuts. If anything, what we ought to do is make it easier for people to apply for jobs based on their skills rather than based on post-secondary credentials.
Thank you, Dr. Hess. We'll go with another question. So the coronavirus has caused some industries to undergo rapid and unforeseen changes, while in others, it accelerated changes that were already underway. What long-term effects do you think COVID-19 will have on the American education system? Sort of either higher ed or K through 12. Feel free to respond to that.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think the answers will be real different. At the higher ed, I mean, there probably is, it'll probably be highly differentiated. There are places, there are about 100, 150 elite universities in this country, which basically run like a, Club Med business model. Lots of people want to come, they're exclusive. People want to overpay for the experience. The Ivies, the Berkeleys, the Michigans, nothing's fundamentally going to change for them. They might deliver some more stuff online, but part of why you're paying $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, especially for some of these elite, especially at the Oberlin Swarthmores, is because you want to go hang out on the coffee shop and, play, Frisbee on the quad. And it's hard to do that virtually. Then there's a whole bunch of higher ed, the vast majority of higher ed, which is much more about helping people actually live their lives. It's about getting skills that they need in order to be able to feed their family. It's getting retraining because their industry was disrupted. And there, like I mentioned, California Community College a couple minutes ago, it's hard for people to wait around 4 months until you start a spring semester. What they want is they want training to start next week because they got to get retrained so they get a new job. So I think a lot of the assumptions that got built into brick and mortar delivery over the years about what's normal, what's acceptable in terms of timeliness, timeframes, credentials, a lot of these things are going to be revisited. But part of it is that they're very much hardwired into federal lending, federal aid, state level financing. So part of what's going to hold back the kind of shift that would probably be better for students and workers and employers is the pace at which the bureaucratic machinery and statute is going to allow people to evolve. At the K-12 level, one of the really interesting things out of this, well, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things, is I got like my 6-year-old running around being crazy upstairs, in the middle of all this stuff. For a lot of kids, the pandemic has been devastating. School districts have lost 20, 30% of kids. In some cases, a lot more. We've seen suicidal thoughts. We've seen hotline calls just go off the charts. It's been horrific for kids, especially kids who live in tough circumstances. Small, unsafe homes, unstable homes, you name it. At the same time, we've also seen that some parents really like hybrid schooling. Support for homeschooling has actually grown during this. Parents have realized that, oh my God, my kid wasn't learning anything in school. I never knew this. Or I had no idea what the teacher was actually telling them. And now suddenly I can kind of audit their history class, and I'm really evaluating that. And so EdChoice, which has been doing a great monthly polling panel on this throughout, now reports that a little over 40% of families say they'd like to have some kind of hybrid going forward. So I think what you're going to see is, competing demands on schools where a lot of families and kids are like, we got to get our kids back in because they need their mentors, they need their friends, they need the safety. And you're going to see some number of families saying, hey, I really like some of what this has allowed in terms of, as a parent, in terms of flexibility, in terms of parents who maybe work non-traditional hours or non-traditional jobs. And, and that's going to create a lot of pressure on one-size-fits-all systems, because if suddenly they've got demands from parents who want 3-day-a-week in-person school and parents who want 5-day-a-week, suddenly things like school choice are going to look a lot more appealing to the education systems, which otherwise are stuck trying to meet every need for every family.
One of our audience members asks a little bit about the school choice question, but they ask, should non-traditional schools, charters, vouchers, etc., be held accountable for public dollars? Should they have to provide the same evidence about the effectiveness of their programs that states ask of traditional schools?
No. The simple answer is, state-run programs are functionally a monopoly. The state says, unless you opt out, you are required by law to send a child there. So if the state is telling parents, you have to send your kid to this, the state has an obligation to ensure that there's some baseline quality, what's going on. It's kind of, if the state is going to go around encouraging all of us to take Moderna or Pfizer, the state has an obligation to run a reliable FDA process. If the state is saying, hey, in a different circumstance, if there are designer drugs out there which are not addressing a public health crisis, but which people may or may not adopt, the state, there are different kinds of approval mechanisms in place for different kinds of it. So look, if people want to opt out of the state, of the state system and access other choices, it's reasonable for the state to say that public funds have to be spent responsibly. So there absolutely should be fiduciary responsibility. There should be auditing. There should be reporting on use of funds. It's reasonable to have state requirements regarding, say, building codes, just as you would for any, private daycare. But the idea that the state ought to be in the business of trying to micromanage instructional quality in an alternative setting in the same way it does in a state-managed entity, I don't think is necessary or useful.
One of our audience members is asking what you think about the role of teachers' unions in determining educational outcomes. They ask, are the needs of the teachers being served at the expense of the needs of students, sort of how with how schools have been closed in different states, that whole thing going on right now?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things going on. So one, there's a fundamental problem with public unions in general, which is private unions are disciplined by the fact that if they're too aggressive, they tend to bankrupt their employer, and then the union has problems. So there's a natural check in a market economy on private sector unions. Public sector unions, as has been pointed out since forever, don't have that same natural constraint. If you demand more money from a Department of Education, teachers get more money. So this is why, for instance, in Los Angeles, by about 2030, about 40% of pupil expenditures, I think it's 40%, might be 30%, I think it's 40 though, 30 to 40% of per pupil expenditures are going to be going into teacher retirement benefits, predominantly for retired educators, rather than actually serving the kids in the classrooms or the educators in the schools. It's why, for instance, the New York City United Federation of Teachers runs voting precincts down in Boca Raton, because retired teachers from New York City are voting on how the union approaches things with an eye to protecting their benefits rather than. So look, the idea that unions have interests which are not necessarily those of students and families should be obvious. Of course they do. They are obliged to provide due process to their members. That means even if a teacher engages in sexual assault, the union has a legal responsibility to protect that teacher as best they can, which obviously can lead to problems in terms of making sure learning environments are safe for kids. Specifically in terms of how unions go about their work, look, unions have consistently demanded heightened level of benefits. They tend to be dominated by veteran educators because those are the ones who have the most at stake in the union and have the longest investment. And that means they tend to worry more about protecting the perks for senior teachers. So when you get teacher negotiations, for instance, you tend to see layoff requirements that the last hired teachers get laid off, rather necessarily than the least effective teachers get laid off. You tend to see protections for veteran teachers in terms of salary schedules, which means raises for newer teachers can be non-competitive. You tend to see unions working very hard to protect pension systems, which only reward teachers who've taught 20 plus years, punishing teachers who are maybe going to teach for 5 to 10 years. And the reality is most of you on this call, if you're currently in college or recently out of college, you're much more likely to teach 5 or 10 years than you are for 20 to 30. You get punished by pension systems, but unions have defended these systems as opposed to figuring out ways to bridge into more 21st century mechanisms. And then obviously, when it comes to the pandemic, what we have seen is unions consistently using the pandemic as an excuse to demand more resources. In Los Angeles, the Los Angeles teachers, they signed a memorandum of understanding last spring with the superintendent in which they were working 3 to 4 hours a day. So half of their contract day for full pay. You might think that it's one thing to say teachers obviously are going to be working from home because schools were closed, but they need to be working a full 8-hour day because it's more important than ever that they be working text messages and Zoom to talk to parents and talk to kids and help them with this crazy transition. Instead, their day was suddenly cut in half. That was not atypical across the country. We saw that in Broward and Boston and in any number of places. When the question was debated about whether to get kids back to school this fall, when the public health was pretty darn clear that with masked and appropriate social distancing, you could certainly open schools at least half time. You saw teachers in Milwaukee, for instance, going to a public park, elementary school teachers, holding up cardboard gravestones for themselves and saying, telling their second graders that if their second graders go back to school, they're going to be killing their teacher. This is pretty darn traumatic for 6 and 7 and 8 and 9-year-olds to be hearing and seeing on the TV news. So, sure. Do unions at times have legitimate points? Of course they do. Is some of the scapegoating of unions for gutless decisions by school boards, for irresponsible decisions by policymakers, is some of this fair when unions complain about it? Sure. But generally speaking, I think a lot of what unions do day in, day out, and certainly what they've done during the pandemic, was far more calculated to serve the interest of union members than to serve the needs of kids and students, serve the students they serve.
Dr. S., I know that you spoke in your initial chat or talk about having conversations with people who work in this field on the other side of the aisle. or from other perspectives. And I know that just recently, The Atlantic came out with a cover story for its April issue, deriding private education, specifically elite prep schools of Harvard Westlake and over Exeter, to name a few. Quote, saying that they decide whom to favor with an opportunity to slip through the golden doors and have their lives change forever. I was wondering, do you agree with this critique? And if you do or if you don't, how might you reform the system to address some of the concerns being lodged here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely true. We see it both in K-12 and then in higher ed, where there's certain institutions that have perched in this position where they're selling golden tickets, and then they extract enormous largesse out of this position. And partly you got to ask yourselves, why are we, So let's start with the higher ed one, because I think it's easier. One of the things that goes on, I wrote a piece for National Affairs a couple of years ago called Busting the College Industrial Complex. And our point was quite simple. This huge premium on the college degree is partly an artifact of the misapplication of civil rights law. Back in the Civil Rights Act of 64, one of the provisions was employers weren't allowed to engage in discriminatory practices. And when the Supreme Court weighed in on this back in 1971, they said that there are a whole bunch of hiring practices that were going to be held up to intense scrutiny. So if you wanted to use an IQ test, for instance, or if you wanted to give a potential employee a skills test, that these things were going to be held to a high level of scrutiny. And if you found patterns of unequal racial response, even if it was not obviously discriminatory intent, that could be a problem. This has played out, this has been codified since by Congress. For instance, to the point that an appellate court a few years ago said that an employer could not, that CSX shipping could not ask its drivers to do a strength test, even though they routinely carry 40 and 50-pound packages, because it was discriminatory on a gender basis. Now, as a result, when you take lots of these other hiring criteria out of play, it turns out that there is one means of discrimination among the workforce that escaped unscathed, even though Chief Justice Rehnquist said it shouldn't. And that was a college diploma. Even though we know that there's hugely disparate composition of who gets a college degree, employers have been given basically a free hand to require a college degree for job applicants, whether or not it has any relation to the job in question. So people, therefore, have a lot of incentive to buy a college degree, which then empowers the folks issuing those credentials to play this outside sports. And of course, we know that there are then lots of, wink, wink networks, particularly among the top 50 or 100 institutions, and a whole bunch of employers. And if you ever think about the predicates for problematic employee hiring practices, which have been applied, and you think about, has anybody ever looked at Harvard or NYU or UPenn's relationship with Goldman Sachs? The answer is, of course, no. So one is, I think there's a question both about fairly and fully applying the law about relating to employment and skills discrimination, so as to stop weighting the scales against people who don't don't buy a piece of postgraduate paper, of a post-secondary paper. And then a second is a question about how are these hiring practices playing out, and are they actually comporting with the law? If we keep that in mind and we think about what's going on with like the Harvard Westlakes and the relationships between like the guidance counselors at these bastions of mostly, let's be honest, progressive privilege, and the institutions where they're getting the kids into, there are all kinds of problematic practices playing out in those admissions offices. So if you think back to the Varsity Blues scandal, for instance, of about 2 years ago, when the FBI busted, for instance, USC and Harvard for basically, either turning a blind eye while somebody was gaming the system, or turning a blind eye while somebody was accepting bribes, the institutions got off scot-free. In fact, their leaders got to give these high and mighty declarations about how this is terrible, while the status-seeking celebrity moms wound up getting hauled into court. Well, the IRS says, for instance, that if you give a donation to, say, the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., you give them $500 and they give you a $200 ticket in return, you don't get to deduct all $500. You get to deduct $300 because you have $200 had purchased to a service. But we know, for instance, that the same people who are sending their kids to Harvard Westlake are then writing really big checks to the Stanfords and the USCs and the Dukes. And these places brag about the opportunities to give and forge connections on their website. And those entire contributions are tax deductible. Americans who are working hard and playing by the rules are paying huge subsidies so that rich, connected Americans can buy their kids' way into these bastions of privilege. Should the IRS actually get back in the business of applying even-handedly the same standards it would for corporate malfeasance on higher ed malfeasance? I suspect so. So I think there are problems here, but instead of this somehow being a tale of American inequity, I think it's a problem of the way that progressive elites have frequently hardwired these left-leaning institutions in both 9 to 12 and higher education to serve their interests so that they can go ahead and get good jobs without ever having to face up to the hypocrisy of the systems that they've set up.
We have another question from our audience. So especially this past summer, we've seen the rapid rise in calls from students for professors to resign for their political views or for universities to remove them. And so this audience member points to Georgetown's decision to terminate 2 law professors who discussed the performance in their classes of individuals from specific groups. Where do you fall in this debate? How much political insulation should university faculty have?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to be clear on what happened in the Georgetown case because it's so profoundly troubling. So, one professor was talking to another colleague on a Zoom after a class, a private Zoom, and she was lamenting the fact that they give these tests in Georgia law where Georgetown law, you don't know which student is taking what test. They gave these grades, and she had observed that when you look at the racial composition of her student body, that it appeared that Black students' grades were disproportionately on the low end. Now, what's important here is to know is that we have heard time after time, especially over the last year, but in education, my entire career, that we should not pretend to be colorblind. Micah Pollock at Harvard wrote a book about 10 years ago called Color Mute. We are told that it is dishonest and a moral failure not to talk about race when it's relevant. So it seems to me this professor was doing exactly what the left has consistently said, which was just saying. And she wasn't saying, in fact, what's particularly striking is she wasn't saying this proves a theory of mismatch. She was saying this frustrates the heck out of me. How do I kind of make sure that all these students are doing well? And her colleague was just kind of like, listening. Somebody got a third-party taping of this, put it up. And instead of the Georgetown dean either saying, well, we don't believe in third-party taping of conversations, I'm going to chat with them and, or saying, of course we have to have honest conversations. I'm glad that this professor was wondering about this, and we stand behind this kind of honest self-appraisal. Instead, he said what she said was reprehensible. If observing an empirical fact is reprehensible because it's politically inconvenient, Georgetown law might as well just hang up its shingle and go out of business. So look, there's a couple of things. One, let's be honest, this is not just a question of professors being under threat. There's a huge asymmetry to it. The vast majority of this is targeted at the smaller number of right-leaning professors on campus, or professors who are centrist and dare to say orthodox, heterodox things. The best response to this would be a statement of moral principle from university leaders saying, no, we are here to create a place for reasoned discourse and debate. And we are glad we have some among us who are willing to challenge the conventions of the moment, because that's our business. Unfortunately, they're not willing to do that. In fact, too often, like with our Georgetown dean, they seem to be eager to kind of figure out which way the mob's going so they can lead it. And that means I think it's appropriate that we look at other mechanisms. The American Council of Trustees and Alumni, ACTA, has worked hard with its members who serve on boards of universities to get them engaged in asking hard questions and looking at this, which I think is crucial. But I also think legislators for public institutions are asking, what should they be asking? What should be being reported to them? And while the left likes to kind of decry this as somehow inappropriate, I think when these are publicly funded, publicly overseen institutions, it's entirely appropriate for public officials to be asking important questions and making sure that these institutions are operating in accord with their principles.
I know that we've gotten a little philosophical in our discussion today, but I wanted to kind of lean into that. And I know one perennial question that we always ask about education is really, what is the point? Are we trying to prepare young people for the workforce? Are we creating responsible citizens? Or are teaching a combination of these things and more? What do you think the purpose of education should be?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, for me, it's real simple. It's about helping every child pursue their gifts. Every child I've ever met has strengths. Every child has interests. And teaching is the most natural human, activity there is. Any of us, those you on the Zoom today, right? You've got nieces or nephews or cousins or brothers or sisters, right? I mean, the fundamental dynamic of human interaction is to help each other do things. Here's how you throw a baseball. Here's how you play a video game. Here's how you figure out how to access that website that mom said you shouldn't look at. Like, this is what we do as human beings. And for me, that's what education is about. Now, it developmentally, as kids go from age 5 to age 15, age 25, what it means to pursue your gifts, what it means to develop your skills, what it means to be able to live a good life evolves. And that's partly a question of, what parents want for a child. Partly it's a question of like what children are capable of wanting for themselves. There is a question of, what the state should reasonably expect of citizens. And these things should be, at the end of the day, there should be a healthy tension between these. We should debate them. That's good and that's right. But for me, that core premise is kind of, at the end of the day, what it always comes back to.
We have a final question from our audience, and then Kevin will wrap up. This audience member asks, what are some of the books that you've read on education policy that have really moved you intellectually, and why? Maybe 3 or 4 different books would be a good number.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. God, that's great. So I think Charles Payne wrote a great book about 12 years ago. Charles Payne spent a lot of years at Rutgers in Newark, and then in Chicago, he was at the University of Chicago, working with inner city schools, trying to get better. And he wrote this great book called So Much Reform, So Little Change, which really looks hard at why all these efforts, especially in Chicago schools, didn't really translate the changes inside of them. And we tend to talk about policy instruments, and especially at a place like Yale, it's easy to get caught up in statistics and econometrics. And it's a great look at culture. And how do you think about how real human beings kind of like interact, and why something that makes sense to me plays out totally differently inside. Second great book is David Tyack, famed Stanford historian, wrote a book years ago called The One Best System. The book's got to be, it's got to be 45 years old now. But what he points out is that sometimes it seems like the schools we see in America today have always been this way. It's not the case. What happened was he talks about really between kind of the late 1800s and kind of the mid 1900s, the progressives of an earlier era built what they thought of as kind of this factory model, state of the art, one best system, this giant bureaucracy, series of giant bureaucracies, to make sure that kids are well served. And it's just a wonderful look at like how American education came to look the way it does. But also it's a good reminder about how best laid plans don't always go where you want them to. Third terrific book, Jerry Grant wrote a book back in the 80s or 90s called The World We Created at Hamilton High, which looks at the Hamilton High, a single school, as it changes over about 40 years, and the way that changes in student norms and discipline and larger social changes between like the 1950s and the 1980s totally changed how people experience school and what it meant for them. So and then a fourth book I read, like my friend Checker Finn wrote a book a number of years ago, about 5 or 10 years ago, called Troublemaker. Checker was at the high levels of education policy from the late 60s until today. And so it's kind of a first person account of all the stuff from like Patrick Moynihan to the Reagan years, to he was with Bill Bennett at the US Department of Education, to No Child Left Behind. If you're interested in this stuff, it's a great look.
Okay, I think we might have time for one last question. And this is an audience question asking about how do we move forward from here? The audience member says, you and Pedro advocate for different policy positions, and one of you is likely right and one is likely wrong. It seems to me that Pedro is mostly wrong, but his president is going to adopt them and ignore yours. Where does that get us?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I love it. We should be, we get it backwards. We should be cynical young, because it's such a useful kind of safeguard against silliness. Look, actually, I don't know that that's quite the right way to think about it. Honestly, I'm generally a school choice guy. I think school choice works horribly in West Texas. If you get out any place where there's like one high school for 50 miles, the basic argument that like you're going to choose a good school starts to really break down. Because then we come up with these schemes. We're like, oh, we're going to create 4 high schools within a high school. And turns out the Gates Foundation tried this like 20 years ago. Like, it doesn't work. It doesn't work that well. We wind up creating a lot more bureaucrats, and it's not that school choice isn't the right intuition. It's that it works great if you live in New York City or Chicago and there's 12 elementary schools within walking distance. Then it's a fantastic model, but it plays out differently. Then we've got to think of not about school choice, but about like giving families more flexibility over how dollars get spent. When Pedro and I are arguing about like anti-racism, are there places in this country where where racist kind of anti-Black sentiment lingers even in 2021 in such a way that I have to kind of give Pedro more on this than in most of the country that I'm familiar with? Maybe that's fair. Maybe there's places, because it depends on people and context. And so I think part of this is part of the problem with Biden is going to do these huge things. He's going to mail huge checks to schools. He's going to do one size fits all. Part of the problem is that this technocratic kind of Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders mindset, which is driving the Biden train, doesn't actually allow for the fact that things may actually work differently in different places and for different communities, for people in different need. And that's the real problem. If we can push back against that, then you know what? Maybe Pedro is right more of the time than I might be inclined to think. More of the time, at least in some places, for some people, in some situations. And the beauty of federalism, of the American system, is that it creates room to allow these truths to kind of like work out and for us to learn from them. And I think that, for me, is kind of what's most disconcerting about how the Biden administration seems poised to go about stuff.
Okay. And with that, we'll wrap this wonderful discussion up. But thank you so much, Dr. Hess, for taking the time to speak to the Buckley program. And thank you to our audience members for their wonderful questions.